All right, kicking off another show, Zen and Call Signs. I have a kind of a friend of mine. We met, I think, in 2016 when I was just about to get out of the Marine Corps. Lieutenant Colonel retired Isaac Lee. Sir, thank you for being on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
All right. Well, we last had a conversation about I was getting out of the Marine Corps. I think you were on your last tour. And we'd chatted, I think our conversation probably something around, wing ops. But then you'd mentioned that I think we'll go back, chronologically, but I'd love to start off with, you almost had a business in the Marine Corps that was incredibly successful. And I'd love for you to just touch a little bit on that, more or less picking up where you left off from 2016.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks for asking. And it's interesting. I've done a few of these lately, and that has not come up. It's not really something I talk about at this point, and I almost sometimes forget that it ever happened. But it does tie into the story of the book a little bit. So, I published this book, Hangar 4, this last spring. But I originally sat down and attempted to write version one of that book around 2007 after I'd done my first fleet tour in the Marine Corps. And I was out at Mott's One as an instructor. And I had discovered this about myself, but that writing was just a good positive activity for me. I've always had what I call a hyperactive thought process. So I'm thinking about like 5 things at once all the time. My brain's going 1,000 miles an hour. But writing is one of the few things I've found that makes me concentrate enough that I stopped thinking about everything else. So it's just a good, healthy outlet for me. So I sat down and started trying to write this book because I had kept a journal, and I did keep a journal the entire time I was in the Marine Corps. But what I discovered at that point was that it was too soon. Like the experience was too close. And so writing about it, I didn't get very far at all, but because it started to stress me out again. I went right back to like a combat stress level. So I had to put it down, but I didn't want to put down writing. And so I kind of came up with this harebrained idea of, I've always liked college football. Maybe I'll just start a college football blog. This is something totally mindless I can write about that has basically no emotion, certainly no stressful emotion tied to it. And it'll just give me a reason to sit down and write a little bit every day. And so I did that with no real plan. I didn't know what I was doing when I started. I mean, I literally taught myself how to build this website, on Google and started writing. And it did actually get pretty big over the course of the next few years. And then it got to the point where it had quite the audience. And then around the time I selected for command, which was a few years later, 2013, I'd had it going for about 6 years at that point. And I had a pretty good group of writers that were doing it with me. So I just handed off to them and was like, hey, thanks. It's been a great ride, but I'm going to need you guys to take it from here so I can really focus on what I'm doing. And I put it down then. But it was a good outlet for me, honestly, just a good creative outlet, a good healthy thing for me to do.
Well, and I think that that's important for anybody to have that like side, like if you have that mind, again, that could even be like that anxiety, depression, where you're constantly in the feedback loop, and now I can say that like where I'm like outlaying it somewhere else, and I found that to be helpful at times too.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's starting to be, studies about writing with the intent of overcoming trauma. Not to say that what I experienced, I still don't even like to think of it as trauma, even though I know technically that's what it is. But it's actually therapeutic in a lot of ways to write about experiences that you've had. It can be very helpful and cathartic.
Yes. Well, to kind of now backing up a little bit, if you'd kind of tell us your story, kind of where you're from, what was, did you want to go into the Marine Corps pilot wise? Would you want to be a pilot? Kind of start us back on young,
Of course. I'll say, so the very short version is this. I grew up in Lubbock, Texas, dusty West Texas down. My dad was a high school football and baseball coach, so kind of call it a D-list celebrity in my hometown. And I just grew up immersed in sports, That's what we did at our house. My dad coached. He made time to coach me personally growing up. So everything at our house was about competitiveness, mental toughness, all the taglines associated with being a half decent athlete. And that was really my focus the entire time I was growing up. And then when I got finished with high school, probably the first very intelligent decision I made was accepting the fact that I probably wasn't going to be a Major League Baseball player. So I stopped chasing that deliberately and just went to college at Texas Tech. And I really made that decision at the last minute, like as I was graduating high school. but I didn't really have a plan from there. I went to college not because I really wanted to. I wasn't passionate about studying something in particular. I just felt like that's what I was supposed to do. But frankly, I was kind of lost. So for like the first 3 years, I'm banging through college, getting pretty good grades, but I didn't really care. Like nothing was sparking my interest in particular. And I did an internship the summer after my junior year at an advertising agency and frankly hated it. So I got out to my parents' house one night after doing this internship. My dad's sitting in the driveway in a lawn chair like he always did in the summer. And I start telling him, like, I'm doing this internship. I hate it. I don't want to do this. I need to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. And, you know, he was getting kind of frustrated with me fairly. But from their driveway, you could see the landing pattern at what was then Reese Air Force Base. And the T-37s, you know, the training planes were out in the pattern that night. We could see them from where we were sitting. And it got to a point in the conversation where he said, well, what are you going to do? And I just pointed at those planes and said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to be a pilot in the military. And in fairness, it was something that I had thought about a few times, but not seriously. And he looked at me like I was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever said, which was a fair reaction given the randomness of the comment. And he just got up, went in the house. He didn't say anything. But in that moment, I decided that's what I'm doing. I'm going to figure this out. And it took about a year.
There was nothing before
that. I figured it out. Not really. I had one high school teacher who was a retired Air Force colonel that I thought was a pretty cool guy. That was it. Like that was really, you know, the majority of my exposure. I had also an uncle who was an enlisted Marine, but you know, I'd see him once every other year or something. He always seemed like this super cool dude, but you know, I didn't really know anything about it until I decided that night, like, hey, let me go. I think I'm going to try to figure this out. And I did. And next thing you know, I got a Marine Corps aviation contract and I was heading off to OCS and kind of did it from there.
Okay. Wow. I like that. I've found this phrase and I want to say I've coined this. It's called fire, ready, aim. And that's what you did right there.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. The one thing I felt confident about was the thing I missed the most about sports at that point in my life was just being part of a team and being around a group of like great guys with a common purpose. And that was the primary thing I was looking for in the military that I hoped I would find and ultimately totally did. Like that's exactly what I found. So it ended up working out perfectly.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Yeah. Continue.
Yeah. So did that, went to officer candidate school, summer of 97. So full peacetime Marine Corps, didn't know a damn thing. You know, I was just as clueless as anyone else who shows up in Quantico there. But that went pretty well. The basic school went well. You know, at that point I was it was starting to click and I was starting to get it and I liked it. And along the way there, the smartest thing I did and never stopped doing was I actually started a journal when I went to officer candidate school, really just because I thought I'm never going to remember all this. And there's so many crazy things happening around me that I'm finding entertaining in various ways that I don't want to forget them. So I started the journal and never stopped, which became very helpful later. But then I went down to flight school. Flight school went well, ended up selecting helicopters and ultimately got CH-53 Echo helicopters on the West Coast was my assignment. And by the time all that training was done, I got to Miramar and checked in the squadron the first time in Hangar 4 at Miramar in December of 2000. Which was obviously just a few months prior to 9/11, which I had no idea or no way of knowing that. So my timing was either perfect or terrible, depending on your perspective. I went on my first deployment that summer. 9/11 happens that next fall while we were on deployment. So I was in Okinawa, Japan when it happened. And I'll never forget that day because, you know, we knew, I would say we being our squadron is particularly the pilots in the squadron knew that everything had just changed. We didn't know exactly what was going to happen or when, but we knew, hey, this just got serious. Like we're going to go fight and do something about this. And from that point forward, it just turned into this crazy adventure. You know, we finished up that deployment, didn't really do anything after a big spool up, but came home back to Miramar here in San Diego, reset, and then ended up being part of the initial invasion force into Iraq the next year. So I was on that first deployment where we invaded Iraq in 2003 and then went back 2 more times after that, like consecutively. So three deployments to Iraq in 3 years. So I really grew up in the squadron fighting the war. You know, the first time we went, I was kind of a mid-level guy, division leader, 700 hours, I think, when we pulled out of port. And by the third time I was there, I was the squadron WTI. So I got the full gamut of the experience in those 3 tours. And it was really interesting watching the war evolve and just really transforming into a warfighter, frankly, which I talk pretty openly about in the book, just the mental aspect of that. So you can kind of go on that ride with me from scared, nervous lieutenant to that iron captain that thinks he's 10 feet tall and bulletproof and knows everything and is probably fearless to the point that it's a detriment and a fault. But that was an interesting, ride to go on. And I also talk
Yeah.
about very openly in the book trying to maintain some semblance of a normal home life while you're doing that. I had got married in flight school when my wife and I had our first child, our daughter, the summer before I went to Iraq the first time. So really the first 3 years she was alive, I was not home very much at all. Like I was basically
Yeah.
always gone. I was either in Iraq or I was on some training detachment or something, even when I was home. So that was a pretty rough ride for us for those 3 years as a family. And just trying to balance all of those things simultaneously was really hard for sure.
Where is the intersection of skill and luck, or what do you think about that?
Dude, that is a great question. And I will tell you that's something that really kind of nagged at me quite a bit while I was doing it, because I very much believed you have to believe that you're damn near indestructible to be in the right mindset to strap into an aircraft and go do some of the things that we were doing.
Yeah.
But you do have this series of close calls. And one of the things that I had the hardest time with at home between deployments was when things got quiet and you actually had time to sort of reflect and think. I would ask myself that exact series of questions. Are you good? Were you lucky? Was it divine intervention? Is that real? I mean, it's all these huge questions you can't possibly answer for yourself. And there's a randomness to death, if you will, that can really mess with you. You've had this experience, you've survived it, you've had these close calls, but at the same time, you're very aware that other people around you, in some cases, people you perceive to be much more skilled than you are, met with a tragic ending. And so you constantly have this awareness that it could happen any day, any flight, any time.
Yeah.
And to deal with that, and I don't know that everyone does this, but this is certainly what happened with me, is I got very quickly to this phase of what I call acceptance, where I just assumed this is probably how this will end for me. And I have to be okay with that, because to not be okay with it would be prohibitive to continuing to do it, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
you sort of build this mindset, this mentality over time that allows you to function and be who you need to be in that environment. But I was initially, I will say I wasn't totally aware. It just kind of happened. And then once it did happen, that's when I started to sort of question myself and feel like, am I crazy? Like, because I actually got to the point where I liked it and I wanted to fly the craziest, most dangerous flight on the darkest night all the time. But consciously, I knew like that's probably not normal. Like you probably shouldn't want to do that. You're not
Right.
having a typical reaction. But honestly, it wasn't until later that I started to really recognize and at least better acknowledge those things to myself and understand that the experience was having or had an effect on me that was certainly different than a lot of the other people around me. And the way I always described it was over time, my observation was, say you got 30 pilots in the squadron, the vast majority of them are kind of in the what I call the middle group. They're trained, they have the fortitude, they can do it. Like they can execute in combat, but they don't particularly like it, but they can do it. On one extreme, you got one or two that find they just can't do it, period, right? Like call it your goose scenario, or what I can't remember the guy's name now who turned his wings in Top
Iceman,
Gun.
Maverick.
Yeah, whatever. Cougar. It was Cougar
Yeah.
that turned his wings in.
Oh,
But you find
sorry.
that a couple one or two guys like that, you find like that just can't do it.
Yeah.
But then on the
Yeah.
other extreme, you got a couple weirdos in the squadron that just thrive in that
Yeah.
environment and seem to actually be enjoying themselves. And I ultimately realized I was one of those. And then once I realized that, I started thinking to myself, like, something's wrong with you. Like, you probably should, this isn't
Yeah.
normal. Like, you shouldn't think this way about it. But I also believed that's exactly who I needed to be to continue to do what I was doing. And so I didn't want to mess with that formula at all. But I'd kind of made this mental note for myself: when you get to the end, whatever the end is, assuming you survive all of this, you're going to have to go back and figure that out. So it was sort of like this
Yeah.
marker I put in the sand out there in the distance somewhere, and knew I need to go back and figure that out at some point.
That's interesting you say that, because I think of myself too in some ways that I thrive in chaos. And
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes doesn't do well with a family, right? Like chaos and families like, ah. So how have
Yeah.
you, from, because I had kids in pilot training too. So I was like had kids pretty young. So I
Yeah.
had like kids the entire time. I got married before I went in the Marine Corps. And so how did you wrestle with those two things? Because I tried, I think to just go home, turn the switch off is like, it's not that I wish I could. I think I tried to do
Yeah.
a
You
pretty good job,
can't.
but it's like, how did you approach that as a father, husband, and kind of going back to like, it's like chaos, war, home, kids, wife.
Yeah. It was really damn hard. And I will tell you, I did not do it perfectly and arguably even well. And really, what happened there, especially in those 3 years when I went to Iraq 3 times in 3 years, my wife is at home with what started as an infant or a young daughter. And in the brief periods I was home, I never really was able to totally reconnect with them. And it wasn't their fault. It had nothing to do with what they were doing. It was just me. And the way I describe it and talk about it really openly in the book was it was like living on two different planets simultaneously. And those two
Yeah.
planets have completely different requirements, right? So on this one, you're supposed to be this warfighter guy who's unflappable, that's in this mindset to do what he needs to
Yeah.
do, and then to try to then come home and snap your fingers and be a normal, well-adjusted husband and father in the suburbs of San Diego. It's like, it's impossible. So it was
Yeah.
always very hard for me to reconnect. And I wasn't, doing anything crazy at home or being abusive or anything like that. I was just very disconnected, and it was almost impossible for me to reconnect. And I also thought of it like a lot of times it didn't feel like I was with my wife and daughter at home. It felt like I was staying with some lady and her kid while I was in town for a few weeks. And again, not their fault.
Yeah.
Totally. But that's how it
Yeah.
felt for me, because I had to stay in that same mindset because I know I'm going back here before too long, and I have to be ready when I do.
Yeah. Do you have any times, anywhere through your career, your 20 years, where you failed and that you'd want to share as a failure that then you recovered from, or what do you have in that sense?
Yeah, for sure. I would say really the big one for me was on our way home from the first Iraq War, OIF-1. We had a beer day on the ship. Basically, hey, we won, the war's over, blah, blah, blah. So,
Yeah.
everyone's having a few beers and doing their thing. But, everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, a lot of people also had a secret stash that they weren't supposed to have because you're not supposed to drink on the ship. But it didn't take too long for the secret stashes to come out. And ultimately, me and a couple other guys got in trouble for drinking on the ship on a beer day, which takes talent to get in trouble for drinking on the day you're allowed to drink. But I will tell you, I thought I really took that hard. And I thought at that time,
Yeah.
like, that I had totally, like, it was bad. Like, I felt like, oh man, I just totally screwed up. I screwed myself. I screwed the squadron.
Yeah.
Like, this is a huge mistake. And ultimately, my punishment ended up being I was supposed to go to the weapons and tactics instructor's course when we got home from that deployment. My punishment was that I didn't get to go, but I went on another deployment, and basically, well, be forever appreciative of this, but the command gave me a chance to recover. They were like, hey, look, you're still one of our up and coming guys. We trust you. We need you to be the best version of you on this next deployment. Let's go do it. And I did. And then they ultimately sent me to WTI after that, which resulted in me going back to Iraq a third time. So in a weird way, it really worked itself out, because going to Iraq that third time, even though we just talked about, call it the downside of that, trying to balance that in your personal life, professionally, it set me up great because at that point I'd done 3 combat deployments, had a ton of combat flight time, every qualification, a ton of experience. And that ultimately resulted in me being invited back to the Weapons and Tactics School in Yuma to be an instructor. And going back there to be an instructor is really the thing that put me on the path that led to everything else that happened after that in the Marine Corps. For certain, it opened up the rest of the doors. So in a weird twist of irony, had I never gotten in trouble for drinking on the boat, it may not have played out that way. So
Yeah.
it was one of those things at the time that feels like this huge mistake where you've totally derailed yourself and ended up in a roundabout way helping me. But it was a great lesson to learn at a great point in my career, to be honest with you.
Okay. Interesting. What was I going to say? Mention something else here. So, did you spend any time in Afghanistan?
I did later. Yeah. So I
Okay.
did all that stuff as a captain, did the 3 trips to Iraq.
Yep.
Side note, my call sign's Whisky. That was related to getting in trouble drinking
That's
on the
right.
boat. So one positive outcome, another positive outcome. So I went to the Weapons and Tactics School, did that. I was instructor there for 3 years, which is great. And it kind of let our family reset, get back on the same page.
Yeah.
Decided to have a second child. So our son was born while we were there. Then the Marine Corps made me run through command and staff, do, 1 year master's program. But that put me heading back to Miramar in the summer of 2010 as a major. So I came back, checked back into Hangar 4, actually to the same squadron I'd been in before, HMH 465, and immediately got tapped to take a detachment to Afghanistan. The Marine Corps was doing something at the time with the 53 community that to this day I still don't understand. It was not a good idea. But they took half a squadron from the West Coast and half from the East Coast, mashed them together for a combat deployment. So I was the detachment officer in charge for 465, but 461 from the East Coast brought the flag and their commanding officer. So I was working, for him, with him. Great guy, really like him personally, but it was just a very difficult situation. And I talk about that in the book too, because just the units culturally were very different. And so they spoke a language that our Marines from the West Coast just didn't totally understand. And so there was a lot of friction just getting the squadron to gel. So probably the most difficult leadership challenge I've ever been part of was mashing those 2 halves of the squadron together. And it really took a couple of months and one big successful mission that we executed, recovering a downed Army CH-47 on a tactical recovery of aircraft and personnel that really kind of brought it together. And after that, it was fine. But for those first couple of months, it was definitely felt like an arranged marriage. And it didn't seem like anyone was super happy about it that was in that unit.
Yeah. So that's kind of going into my next thought about leadership. I would say, like, what comes to mind for 53, since you spent a good bit of time is there, how does a squadron get to the point where they're hovering over the deck, doing the who can land on deck with the least amount of fuel? How do you think, from a macro leadership perspective, how does a squadron get to that point?
Yeah, that was a great question. And one of the, I would say, strangest stories I've still ever heard. But in a way, I can see how you could get to that. Certainly not condoning it. Not a good idea. Definitely a dangerous game to play for certain. But I do think that we always had this never-ending presence in the Marine Corps of like this one-upsmanship, right? Like everyone's a hyper competitive. Everyone is pretty confident. And so there was always some kind of contest going on internal to the squadron. Who's best at this? Who's best at that? I can land better than you. I can aero refuel better than you.
Right.
And there's a lot of just call it good natured banter in
Right.
that. But to me, that was certainly a scenario where it got taken too far into a wrong place that ultimately, unfortunately, did not end well for that unit. But a great lesson learned there about there's a line there with the games that we should play with one another, if you will, and what kind of contests are healthy and good and make us better, and what kind can be very detrimental if we're not extremely careful.
Right. All right. Sorry, I'm breaking up a little bit. I'll edit this type of stuff out, but the audio should come in pretty well because it's still downloading on your end. Looks like it's still working. So with that being said, leadership wise, so what kind of a deep question here is that, I bet it's evolved because it certainly has for me, is what has been your like philosophical operating system? Like how have you thought about things from being like, hey, I'm in flight school, I just got to worry, into like getting in a squadron, I just got to worry about myself, then
Yep.
into gaining more people underneath you and being a leader and how like you carry yourself, how you think about things. So kind of what do you use as your operating system?
Yeah, absolutely. So for myself, I've always been someone, to coach's kid, to use a sports analogy, that's really always believed like just leave it all on the field. Don't ever be in a situation where I never wanted to be in a situation where I felt like I could have put more effort into something and that was the reason I didn't succeed. Admittedly, I tend to overcorrect probably too far in the other direction. So I can be a total workaholic. I can obsess about things. I can put a lot of time and energy into things to give myself the best chance of success. But I'm doing that because I don't ever want to regret or feel like, damn, you should have put more effort into this. So that helped me succeed as a young officer because frankly, I just outworked pretty much everybody. I mean, there were always a few other weirdos that were going as hard as I was, but I was definitely going hard. And then when I became a field grade, I mean, I got the chance to do the detachment officer in charge in Afghanistan. Then I did a 31st MEU detachment as detachment officer in charge. So really unusual to get to be a dead OIC twice as a major. But that's really where I fell in love with and refined my whole approach as far as being a leader, because that was really the first time I felt like I'm literally in charge of these people. I'm responsible for these Marines. And not only do I want them to be professionally successful, I want this to be a great experience. And I kind of worked through that and came really to some very basic conclusions that the key to the whole thing was really earning their trust and respect. And I felt like that responsibility was mine, not theirs. And to this day, I believe that's true of any leader. Like if you're going to lead anybody, you have to earn their trust and respect. They don't owe it to you. Titles, positions, whatever, all that gets you is what I call courtesy. But actual trust and respect has to be earned. But if you can earn it, you get a whole different level of output from the people you're leading. So that was kind of focus number one. And then focus number two really has always been for me, just keep it simple. Because I feel like as human beings, our instinct is to demonstrate how intelligent we are and come up with these great ideas, and the more complex, the better. But in reality, if you're leading an organization, or at least most organizations, the people down at the end of the whip that have to execute it, they need that to be given to them in a way that's fairly straightforward and simple so that they actually can do it. And so I always kept that in mind with the Marines too. And that really led to a couple of years later, I got selected for command of a squadron here at HMH 462 at Miramar. And every commanding officer has to literally publish this document called a command philosophy. And I'd seen several of these over the years. It's usually at least a page. And I would always read them and think like, okay, well, there's a bunch of great words in here, but it's probably not going to be effective because 99% of the Marines in the squadron aren't even going to read this damn thing. And if they do, there's too much information in there for them to use it as a singular guiding light, right? Which is really the underlying intent of this whole thing. So when I did that, I actually got it down to one word. And the one word was fundamentals. And the fundamentals were, we fix, we fly, we take care of ourselves and each other. Like, that's it. That's the list. Like, if we do those three things, we're good. And now that probably sounds like oversimplifying something very difficult or very complex. And it kind of is, but it was effective. It made it real simple for the entire squadron to know, hey, these are the three things that are important. We do those three things, then everything else kind of has a funny way of working itself out. And it did. So to this day, even in the business world, I try to keep things as simple and straightforward as possible for my entire team. And I always just stay focused on that piece of earning trust and respect. And it clearly acknowledge that never ends. That's something you have to start right away and then consistently do every day, consistently be yourself, consistently be engaged, consistently demonstrate that you actually care about these people, and you'll earn that trust and respect. And once you've done that, then you can actually be pretty effective.
So that style, does that evolve over time? Did that come from somewhere else, like father, anywhere else, or is that all you?
It was really mine. And it really came from, if I'm being honest, observing senior officers while I was growing up in the Marine Corps and taking a never ending series of notes and lessons learned on what didn't work. And so it was really this process of elimination that I established over the time I was a captain and a junior major, of
Yeah.
watching all these other people, in my opinion, struggle and kind of going, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And by the time I had done that for a few years, I just whittled it down to like, okay, this just needs to be really basic, do these couple of things well, and you got a pretty decent shot. And so going into command and deciding to make it that simple, I knew was a bit of a risk. And I certainly got some feedback about it, like kind of going into it, like, oh, you shouldn't do that. That's not going to work. And you need to do X, Y, and Z. And I really did it my way anyway, believing that that was probably the best thing to do. And it did work out. It actually worked very well. Our squadron performed well. We ended up being, the HMH Squadron of the Year for 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing that year, et cetera. So that really was sort of my personal proof of concept, like, hey, this is an effective way to approach this. And then it really made me curious. And I actually had already decided early in my command that I was going to transition out of the Marine Corps at 20 years, which would be a year after I gave up command. But that's really what spawned me to want to go into the business world and see if it also worked there.
Yeah.
That was really my desire, was I want to go out into a civilian company that has nothing to do with DoD, where they don't even know what lieutenant colonel means, and see if I can have a similar effect with these same principles. And so that was really interesting for me. And that's basically what I've been doing ever since I transitioned out.
Did you use your journal? Because I did to some degree, not as sounds like it's not as prolific as you, to as like your reference point to go back to, see what you thought, did things, and, maybe how you could do things better.
Yeah, I think so. Honestly, one of the things I did semi recently that really helped me with that was, and it came in very handy, that I kept a journal the entire time I was in the Marine Corps. So I had written all of this experience down, and I'm a nerd, so it was all electronic and very organized. But I transitioned out in 2017, got busy doing all my other stuff, so to speak, kind of starting this new life. But I knew I needed to and wanted to go back and revisit that. And so that's really part of the reason I ended up writing this book. I had a couple other things, I was hoping to accomplish, and frankly, just help people by sharing the story. But to do that, I had to go back through and review the journal essentially in its entirety. And that was extremely helpful to me, in that I could see the point of view I had at the time. And I could see that point of view slowly morphing and changing over the course of time and experiences. So it was really neat to kind of go back and almost have myself tell me the story of how I sort of evolved into the person that I am today, which was a pretty cool experience, to be totally honest with you. And it also is the reason that I wrote the book the way that I wrote it, which is frankly a little different, I think, than most people who write memoirs about their time in the military. Is I was very wide open about, this is what I was thinking and feeling as I was traveling through this experience. I really wanted to let people inside of my head, and committed early to no revisionist history. So even in cases where I screwed up or I probably sound like a jerk, that's what happened. And that was part of my evolution as an officer and ultimately as a human being. So I wanted to just lay all that out there in a way that people could see that evolution happen over time, as I was, moving forward throughout the experience. But that whole exercise was great for me, and it really helped me in a bunch of ways.
Beethoven said something. He said that if he didn't write it down, he wouldn't remember it. I agree with that. To like have to look back, because like I honestly don't know what I did this morning. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it certainly was helpful for me. And it was something I
Yeah.
decided to do kind of on a whim when I got to OCS, and luckily just never stopped. But having written it all down helped me a ton. I mean, this book would have
Yeah.
never happened if I didn't have that journal. I mean, that was
Yeah.
absolutely the source material for what I used to write it.
Yeah. Kind of going back to philosophy, do you have a particular,
Mhm.
philosopher, book, or anything you've referenced as part of your framework?
No, not really. I was never like a super prolific reader or student. And I will openly admit to you that here's why, is what I had observed just as a kid like watching my dad coach, he did have a
Mm.
pretty simple approach, and it was pretty straightforward also. And then what I observed early in my Marine Corps career was there were other people around that were like big readers and studiers and had gone to really prestigious schools.
Yeah.
And I often felt like something that was an inhibitor for them, and this is just my opinion and observation, was they had almost too many ideas in their head about the same thing to consistently execute any one of them. So they were
Yeah.
just sort of this hodgepodge of a person and how they functioned and thought and referenced and led. There was no consistency to it. And I felt like my best chance at being consistent, steady, predictable, someone that was easy for the Marines I was responsible for to understand, was to just not do that. So I really focused on learning by doing and observing all the others around me. And that was really I was super observant, and I paid attention to everything and wrote it down and was like, I'm watching what that guy's doing, and that's definitely not working. So I'm going to learn from that.
Yeah.
Or, and in some cases, watching what that guy's doing, and hey, something he's doing is working really well. What is it? And trying to figure that out. And that was really kind of how I went about it. So I was almost studying
Interesting.
people instead of
Yeah.
studying books, is really what I was
Yep.
doing.
I like the OJT style. And that works. Because I think a
Yeah,
lot of people, it's like there's no more books to read, and everybody, it's already all been written and said before. So there's nothing else you need to read.
for sure.
So yeah, I think you took that to heart very early. That's cool. Where was I gonna go? Oh, so my next thought is, so it seems like you had a good transition out of the Marine Corps.
I
I mean,
did.
is that, yes or no, or tell me about that experience, and we'll probably circle around to some other things too.
Of
But
course.
go ahead.
Yeah, it went about as well as it could go. And I will tell you, it went well for the same reasons that other things have ended up going well for me. Is I was a huge nerd. I put a lot of time into it. I planned it, and then I put in the work. So I decided, like I said, before I took command, and that was in the fall of 14, that I was most likely going to transition out in 17 when I hit 20. So I had already done some prep before I took command, because I knew when I took command, I was going to be too busy. So I already had like a decent LinkedIn profile. But the more important thing I'd done was I'd reached out to not a bunch, I'd say about a dozen senior officers that I knew and respected that had transitioned out at 20 years, and just talk to them about what their thought process was. Because I really wanted to see, was their thought process similar to mine? Am I doing this for myself for the right reasons, etc.? Because obviously, when you're on active duty, the primary perspective you're getting are from other active duty officers who are senior to you. And in most cases, my phrase, I coined this as a captain, they generally give you what I call "look how great I turned out" advice. They generally tell you to do exactly what they did and grow up and be just like them, which is not a fault. I understand why they do that. But I
Yeah.
needed to go find that other side of the coin. What about the guys that didn't do that? And that helped me a lot, and it helped me make the decision to transition, but I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And then when I was in command, it became very obvious to me, like, okay, the thing that you really enjoy the most at this point in your life, the thing that's filling up your cup, is this, call it leadership piece, being responsible for these people, taking care of them, making a great experience for them, and also ensuring that the unit functions at a high level. And so that really set me on this course of wanting to go into business, but I didn't know what I didn't know. And so right when I finished up command, I did two things simultaneously. And that was really right around the time you met me. I came up to the wing that summer of 16, and I had 1 year left in the Marine Corps to really get myself ready. And so I started doing two things simultaneously. One, I went to counseling to start making sure that I was okay as a person. And I felt what to me was fine, but I knew I'd had this crazy experience. I knew I'd become very robotic. I knew I
Yeah.
had trouble connecting at home at
Can
different
we?
times. So I wanted
Can I
to
ask you a
start
question
sorting that
there?
out. So I started working on that. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, sorry, there's a little delay here. That's something I think more Marines, probably any guys getting out of the military should consider. Because a lot of guys don't, if you're flying, you're like, hey, I'm struggling with mental something, and it's like, you're out. You're out of the game.
Yep.
And nobody wants to
Yeah.
say that. And I think that was strategic. But so
Yep.
let's say it's
Yeah. I
not,
agree with you.
I don't know if you were done flying or not, but, and again, I think your approach, I imagine, was a simple one, is like, hey, this is my decision. I know I need help. I'm sorry, I'm maybe putting words in your mouth, but like I need help and this is what I'm going to do
Yeah.
because my priority is my family now.
Yep.
I mean, to give me your thought process there.
Yeah, basically, and it was kind of like I alluded to earlier. I decided years earlier that I needed to explore that, if for no other reason than to make sure I understood myself. But it was just kind of this marker in the sand that I had out there in the future somewhere. But as I got closer to finishing up my time in command, I just committed to it and said, you know what, I'm going to do this. I mean, it certainly won't hurt. Right. So I
Yeah.
literally went to my first counseling appointment. I think it was 5 days after I flew my last flight. I flew my last flight on like a Wednesday, did my change of command on Friday morning. And like the next Tuesday, I went to my first counseling appointment. And, I walked into that appointment feeling what I had come to know as fine. But I knew that I probably had all kinds of stuff compartmentalized in there. I knew I'd been very robotic. I knew, there were things there that were missing, and I hadn't really, or I hadn't dealt with them, right? And I knew I'd become kind of fearless to the point that it's arguably dangerous. I'd really shut down most of my negative emotions years prior. Like I no longer had a grief response, or I almost never felt sad. I was just sort of robotic in a lot of ways, and that's what I wanted to unpack. So doing that was the smartest thing I've ever done, honestly, because it helped me start to smartly work through that before it caught up to me. And that was also one of my motivations for doing it. I didn't want to ignore it or just assume I was okay and then be one of those guys a few years later that say goes off the rails and everyone's like, what the hell happened to that guy? He seemed like he always had his stuff together, knew like, hey, this
Yeah.
can happen. So you probably need to get in front of it. And I did. And that helped a ton in the transition, just helping me get back to being the best version of myself as quickly as I could. And at the same time, I just started putting in the work and was networking like crazy all over San Diego. I mean, most evenings I was taken off to go meet someone for coffee or a beer, or going to a networking event. And I was really a sponge. And in doing that, what I figured out fairly quickly was, okay, the operations lane of business is what I'm looking for. It's the most similar to what I know and do. And then I also realized like there's a lot of small to medium sized companies in San Diego that are trying to grow. And that was kind of perfect because I felt like the organization I'll best fit into is a small to medium sized company that's trying to grow, preferably that has a bunch of issues they're trying to solve, so that I can come into the door and help and be effective in terms of leadership, people, process, all the stuff that I felt like I just knew and had been practicing in the military while simultaneously learning the literal business.
Yeah.
And that's how it worked out. So I really just networked like crazy, did all the things, and ended up landing a job. My first job out of the Marine Corps was as the chief operating officer for a manufacturing company here in North County, San Diego. And ultimately transitioned out of the Marine Corps in the summer of 2017, took 1 week off, and then walked in the door of this company as the chief operating officer in a total, admittedly, fake it till you make it situation. Like, okay, I'm here now. I was walking around in a flight suit a week ago, but let's figure out
Yeah.
this manufacturing thing. And it was a great experience. I loved it. I got a ton out of that job. And then about a year and a half later, got a little bit bored, admittedly, and decided like, okay, I want to go help more companies kind of do these same things, kind of basically just get their operations tightened up and be better on the people front. So I started a little consulting company of my own, and my plan was just to bang around San Diego doing that. And one of my very first clients ended up being the company that I work for now. And I did a project for them and came back and said, hey, here are my recommendations. And that resulted in the owner, CEO, saying like, well, why don't you just work here and do it? So we worked that out, and 5.5 years later, I'm still running operations for him, and the company's more than doubled in size from when I started, and we're still rolling. So I think we should get to about triple in size in about another year. So it's been a really rewarding project to be part of as well.
Interesting. All right. Well, switching gears a little bit more, I want to get your thoughts on, I don't know, maybe a little controversial, but since you're out of the Marine Corps now, I think that, and Marines can talk about it. What's your thought on the evacuation of Afghanistan?
Man,
Like from a macro point of view, what do you think? Not just like, hey, they let the bomb go, but like, what are your thoughts in general?
to me, it was just like it made me feel sad. And
Yeah.
it made me feel sad. And it sounds really weird for me to say that because for many years I couldn't feel sad about anything, but it just seemed like such a bad way to end that entire campaign. Like obviously in front of the whole world, it was just not a good way to end it. And the thing though that really made me feel the most sad was there obviously some tragic events happened there at the event. We lost, I believe it
Yeah.
was 13 people, but just knowing how many people I had served with, how many Marines that I had grown to love and care about, how hard they were going to take it, like feeling sad for how it was going to affect them or affecting them actually felt more intense to me than the event itself. Like
Yeah.
I had come to frankly kind of expect that all of this long war was probably going to end in a way that was going to make a lot of us or potentially feel like, what the hell did we do all that for? But knowing that it was having that impact on so many other, Marines, soldiers, sailors, airmen was the thing that bothered me the most.
Yeah. And then kind of that going back into transition, I think that's a lot of people, I would say a lot of guys transitioning out of the military now, young Marines, let's say, any guy in the military, I think hindsight to who they were serving in the Marine Corps, in the military is now coming like it's coming real quick. So they're
Mm-hmm.
questioning, I think, they're questioning their purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what was my purpose then? And now they don't have a mission because they're now just kind of like, here, and what do you want to be when you grow up?
Right.
And so they're questioning everything. And I think that, before we got on to record, I think, and to say it here is that somewhere between 20 and let's say 30 veterans commit suicide a day.
Yep.
And so I guess my question is like, that I feel like that the Afghan pullout and then everybody getting out and like questioning your purpose and your mission is a big issue. And so how do you, I guess my question one for you, how do you think about it? And then what's your thought on the rest of it?
Yeah, well, I would say I did something for myself early in the process when I was doing it, and say the early 2000s when I was going to Iraq on repeat. Every now and then it would come up and someone would say like, we shouldn't even be here or what are we doing here? And I'm thankful that I had enough understanding of myself I never let myself go that route because there was
Right.
no point. Like whether we should be there or not, we're here.
You're already here.
Yeah, and I'm probably
Yeah.
coming back again. So I didn't let myself go down that road. But
Yeah.
what happened instead, and I think this was very healthy and helpful for me, my why was always the Marines to my left and right. Like I thought of it as everything I'm doing, I'm actually doing it for them. We're doing this for each other. The bigger overarching, we talk about the enemy and the mission and all that stuff, and that's literally the job. But I wasn't doing it for that. I was doing it for the people I was around, and I felt this real inherent sense of responsibility to be the best I could be for them and for the Marines on the ground we were supporting, and all of those
Yeah.
things. And that helped me never go down that rabbit hole, for lack of a better way to put it. And then once I transitioned out, I just kind of stayed in that mindset. And I understood logically, consciously, this is probably going to end in a way that is horribly disappointing, to put it mildly. And it's going to be hard
Yeah.
on my peers and a lot of people I know when it happens. But that was really, they were more my focus as those events unfolded, to be honest with you. But it was also, for me personally, it was super helpful that I had already gotten into the counseling process and all of those things. And I'd been for a few years reaching out to other Marines as appropriate. When I would hear, hey, so is having a hard time, there are substance abuse problems, marriage problems, all of those things are prevalent. Guys can't hold down a job. And I was just reaching out, trying to be a friend. But really in 2021, I was hearing more and more and more of that. And that was honestly the thing that finally compelled me to sit down and write this book. I came to this conclusion that maybe if I did it in a really honest way, it might be in some way helpful to those other service members that are out there that lived a similar experience and are now entering this land of, well, now what? Maybe at least knowing there's one other person out there that has had these same feelings, thoughts, emotions, has traversed this same journey, if you will be in somehow helpful to them. And that was really my final why for sitting down to do it. And once I had that, then I was like, okay, I'm going to sit down and make this happen. Because up to that point, honestly, just I thought about it a few times and was like, what are you gonna do? Write a memoir? Like, who cares? Who the hell are you, man? But that gave me the motivation to be like, okay, well, maybe there is a reason to do this that is definitely bigger than me.
Because you'd mentioned something that I thought's interesting, and in some ways I do something similar. And you'd mentioned how, you put, like in some way you said you put a marker in the sand. And I've
Yeah.
thought into myself, or like I make a bargain with my future self. How would you describe you do that if you're going to tell somebody else how to do that? Like how do you do that?
Well, for me, I've always been probably organized and planful to a fault, but I just knew I had this inherent belief that like I was on this course that was not sustainable and was probably going to end in a way that wasn't good. And
Well,
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
you have an inherent ability to almost like superposition maybe yourself
Yeah.
around things. So how do you do that?
I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. The best thing I can say, or probably the most clear thing I can say, is I just always have this plan for the future that I'm constantly
Okay.
rewickering and formulating. And I
Yeah.
spend very little time thinking about the past. And I try not to let myself think about the past, good or bad, because there's nothing I can do about it.
Right.
So any past failure, relevant, learn the lesson, move on. And at the same time, any past success is no guarantee of success today or tomorrow. So don't spend too much time thinking you're good because of that either. But
Right.
that helps me do a better job of staying in the present. But I'm constantly laying out multiple paths for myself in front of me and constantly, and I just do this naturally, I'm trying to create opportunities for things I might be interested in doing later. The way I describe it back to my children is like you want to open as many doors for yourself as possible so that when you get to that door, you have a choice whether to go through it or not. You can always decide not to. But that's always really helped me as a person continue on this path that I think sometimes from the outside looking in might look like it's a little all over the place. I know for sure when I transitioned out of the Marine Corps and decided to do what I did, almost everyone I spoke to was like, what are you doing? You're crazy. Go be an airline pilot or work at Lockheed like you're supposed to. What are you going to go work for some little manufacturing company? You don't know anything about that. But in my mind, there was a clear path there to a place that I was interested in and wanted to get to. So it made sense to me. And I kind of find these unusual sometimes like paths for myself that I'll take. And even writing the book, I mean, I've never written a book before, but I sat down and frankly did it and it worked out. But when I was doing that, there were several people like, what are you doing? You're a Marine, not a writer. What's your problem? They're like, why would you even think about doing that? It's just
I
one
feel like
more.
that's when somebody says that you're like, okay, I'm doing this exactly what I'm doing.
Yes, that has always been a great motivator for me. If someone tells me I can't do something or shouldn't, then I really want to do
Yeah,
it now.
and I was going to the Marine Corps, and they're like, we gotta go in the Marine Corps because like I'm like, you're not going to be a pilot, and I'm like, what the fuck? I'm abs. That's exactly what happened. Now,
Yeah,
almost 20 years later.
100%. Yeah, and I always enjoy that. Like I love running across other vets and guys I was in the Marine Corps with that do things that are different or
Yes.
non-standard. It's just pretty neat.
Yeah, agreed. Well, we hit about an hour, so I don't want to, crush too much. Oh, you know what? I have one thought for you because I think it's interesting that it's come to light to me. So, I've always loved, I don't know if you do, but I've loved computer games. And I've
Hmm.
seen recently that, where computer games are gaming to help veterans and community, which I can get. But I've also seen like there's like a dark side of gaming too, where you're sucked in, you time suck to anxiety, depression from those things, and that you're just staring at a screen all the time, and it's kind of like, hey, I have ADD, so like here's some Adderall. You're like, I don't
Right.
know. That's kind of what it reminds me of. So since you're a CEO of a squadron, I'm sure you've had guys game and do different things, and now as a veteran, I mean, like, what's your thought on gaming to help veterans either, prevent veteran suicide and or help veterans? What's your thought?
To be honest with you, I'm actually very partial to it. And really for me, it's this reason. Like I grew up, I was on one of the earliest generations that grew up with Atari, then Nintendo,
Yep.
then
Yep.
ultimately graduated to PlayStations. And for me, I've played video games since I was a kid. And I've done it off and on as an adult. But to be honest with you, when I was the squadron CO, we were in Okinawa on a deployment, and I'd always loved the football games, Madden and the NCAA football game. And
Yeah.
my captains got a hold of, at the time, was the last version of the NCAA football game, and found these nerds on the internet to upload current rosters. Well, it turned into a thing where every weekend I would play some captain in this game
Yep.
on this deployment, and it was like an event. So all the other officers in the squadron would come in this, we had this common area lounge, echo chamber, everyone come in and watch. I made it
Yeah.
through the whole deployment without ever losing to any of the captains.
Oh
So I was
my
still
God.
pretty decent at it. But
Epic.
that's kind of a little side note. But honestly, to this day, personally, do like to play video games, but I do it in moderation. And for me,
Yeah.
I only play the sports games. So I still play, Madden, NCAA football just came out. Those are
Yeah.
good. I like the baseball game. But to me, similar to writing, what I've found over time is that a video game requires enough of my attention that I stop thinking about everything else. And I know that takes about 10 to 15 minutes to really take hold.
Yep.
So, what I'll typically do is if I'm feeling particularly on edge or my thought process feels really hyperactive, like I can tell usually, say, sometime between 7 and 9 p.m., I'm pretty sure I will or will not be able to go to sleep. And if I have that
Mm.
feeling that I'm not going to be able to, I will try to go take 30, 45 minutes, play a video game. I don't go too long, but
Okay.
just long enough to help me flip that switch, stop thinking about everything else. And it has a very calming effect on me that I will literally feel after a half
Okay.
hour, 45 minutes.
Have you
Uh,
considered ice bath or cold dunks?
I have not toyed around with those. I've done all kinds of other random stuff though. I mean, my biggest self-regulation or self-care thing I do is I'm up super early every day, old man
Yeah.
disease. So I work out first thing in the morning. Like that's like my one thing I do every day.
Yep.
But I try to do other healthy things. I ride a little bit, I'll play video games. I try to get out and paddleboard some, mountain bike some, mostly physical things, but I still go to counseling
Yeah.
to this day. I don't miss that. That's helpful. So just, I try to have this very regimented routine of, call it self-care and maintenance, that's always going,
Yeah.
a little something every day to make sure I'm taking care of myself, or trying to.
There.
Yeah, it's back. There's one
All
last
right.
little
Can you
freeze.
hear me now? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I've got you back.
You finished off with kind of a regimented self-care and maintenance.
Yeah, that's all I
Okay.
said
Sorry. All
was,
right. Good.
so that self-care routine is really important, but I stay on top of it.
Well, finishing up here just for the last bit, because I think, exercise, workout, super helpful. Do you have any kind of atomic habits that you do workout wise, exercise wise, that you've done? Obviously 3 miles, 20 pull-ups, 20 crunches.
I'll tell you. So about, I don't know, 2 years after I got out of the Marine Corps, I was out running one day. I got a couple miles into it and just decided, I was like, why am I doing this? I never even liked running. Like, this
Yeah.
sucks. And I just stopped
Yep.
running and walked home. But I knew I needed to figure something else out. And at that point, I hadn't done much weight training at all in years, just because Marine Corps, you're training to pass a physical fitness test or a combat fitness
Yeah.
test, and it's different. But I really got into lifting weights at that time. So I'm a big strength training guy. So I do basically what amounts to a full body strength training workout 3 times a week. And I don't miss that ever for any reason. So
Yep.
I make sure I'm up early. I knock that out. And then on my, call them my in between days, I try to be good about this. I'm not as good about it, but do some yoga just at home. And at first, that was something I kind of struggled with, because I felt like, oh my gosh, this is like the corniest thing in the world. I can be doing yoga. Like, what the hell? I've found it to be extremely helpful in a lot of ways, and just kind of keeping myself. I've gotten a lot more flexible. I feel better.
Yeah.
It's good for me. So I really
Yeah.
just alternate between lifting weights and doing yoga. It's like, so lift weights one day, stretch it back out the next, for lack of a better way to put it. And that
Yeah.
routine has been very good for me.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. Because I'm all about longevity and how I do
Yeah.
things now. So that's it. I want to be able to
Yeah.
beat my son up as long as I can.
Yeah. That's a great goal. I
Yeah.
totally get it.
Well, I mean, that's about,
Hmm.
I feel like we kind of covered everything that I'd like to. Is there
Yeah, of
anything
course.
that I missed or that you'd like to mention or chat about or we didn't talk a ton about the book, but I think you covered some things in there. But is
Yeah.
any good story that you'd would like to mention that's in the book?
I would just say overarching. I mean, the book is called Hangar 4. It's a reference to a hangar at Marine Corps Station Miramar that's home to the CH-53 squadrons. So I did all of my deployments, started and ended at Hangar 4. So it's kind of a central point in the story, which is why I used the title. But no, I think anyone who's interested in just like that, the journey that someone goes through becoming a war fighter and then figuring out how to walk away from it at some point, would find interest in the story, as well as anyone who's interested in just the family aspect that we touched on, because that's all in there. But
Yep.
it's been a rewarding project. I mean, it's awesome that it's out. It's literally Hangar for the number 4. It's easy to find on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. And I also have a website, isaacchile.com. And you can find out more about the book there. And all the links to my social media are on the website too. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for anyone who might be interested in that.
Awesome. Well, sir, thank you for your time. I appreciate it and
Yeah, of
look forward
course.
to the next time we have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Stay in touch.
All right. Yes, sir. Thank
All
you.
right.
See ya.
Yeah, we'll see you.